Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Métis Warrior here with Timothy and Alexandria.
Hello everybody.
So today's topic is DNA, because obviously there is some scam artists out there pretending to be indigenous and Métis, and they're trying to get funding from the Canadian government. And let's just say this, there is nothing wrong with being white. If you're a Métis, you have white ancestors. And you also have indigenous ancestors. But to the Fetis Metis, white as rice, but they know they are suckers who will believe their BS. And it's just fake indigenous trying to take real indigenous funding.
And just to let everybody know out there, any group or organization that does not ask for proof does not have a solid registry, folks.
Right. And so if you and this is the important parts that the governments need to understand. If you're going to issue out funding to the indigenous people, they have to actually be indigenous. Now we know there are some organizations that have given Métis cards to people who are not Métis, who are not indigenous, and that's wrong. And it's happened in the West, but it's definitely happened a lot in the East, and we're finding this out. You'd be surprised at some of the ID cards that we've gotten from people who submitted their genealogy to us. We verified that they were not Métis, but you might be surprised at the organization's names of who gave them cards.
It's actually quite shocking, and anybody, it's quite interesting to prove Métis ancestry. Each record must name the parents of the person in that record. Each generation must have its record to link to the previous one.
Exactly. And so we have a special guest, Gwen, who will be joining us by phone. And she's been researching genealogy for 50 years now. And she's definitely spent the last 20 of that helping other people involved in the DNA side of things as well. And so she's going to shed a lot of light on what's going on with this DNA. Now, here's something by Daryl LaRoe. Now, as you all know, we've definitely disagreed with Daryl LaRoe on many things. But let's read this. Recently in Canada and in the United States, a small but vocal minority of white French descendants have used an ancestor, one born between 300 and 400 years ago, and claim to be indigenous. So, and then they claiming to be Métis. So now this is where we do agree with Daryl LaRoe. If you have one indigenous ancestors from 300 years ago, you are not Métis.
Exactly. So if you have one indigenous or Indian ancestor from 1713, you are not Métis, folks. It's just that simple. You cannot claim Métis or indigenous ancestry with one Indian ancestor from over 300 years ago. It's just the fact, folks.
And to Daryl LaRoe, if you hear this show, or if anybody out there knows Daryl LaRoe and they want to send him the show, please send him the show. Because the next time one of these fake Métis show up to try to dispute you, here's what I would tell you. Ask them for their damn genealogy right there and then. Say, well, where's your genealogy? Let me take a look at it. Because I can guarantee you, from the genealogy that we've seen, we've found that a lot of the people in the East claiming to be Métis are not Métis. And when we have to tell them that they're not Métis, they show us the cards from the organizations that have given them cards. And so this is a shame, and we got a huge show coming up on that. But look at this. So Daryl LaRoe, we do not agree with him because we do believe there is in fact Métis in the East. However, we do agree with him on the fact that you cannot have just one indigenous ancestor from 300 or 400 years ago and go around saying you're Métis. But I can guarantee you this, Daryl. If somebody comes to challenge you, ask them for their genealogy. If it proves them Métis, acknowledge it. If it does not, and I can guarantee you, the people that are the loudest are the ones that don't have the genealogy.
Well, let's pose a question. If individuals want to debate Daryl LaRoe, confront Daryl LaRoe, wouldn't you carry your verified genealogy so you could put it right in front of Daryl LaRoe's face and say, yes, Daryl LaRoe, I am a legitimate Eastern Métis. So if you don't have that verified genealogy, stop spewing out this garbage, because you got nothing to back up your hot air from.
Yeah, and like I said, there's a lot of organizations in the East that's giving cards out to people that are not Métis, do not have proven genealogy, and those organizations will probably be surprised to learn that we know this now.
Absolutely.
And so we're going to move on now to the whole DNA aspect, as in 23andMe, etc., etc. Okay, let's read this from 23andMe. Currently, 23andMe has several features that can reveal genetic evidence of Native American ancestry. Although they are not considered a confirmatory test or proof of such ancestry in a legal context, it is important to note that even if an individual in your family tree was considered to be Native American, your own DNA might not reveal the Native American ancestry because each parent only passes down a random half of their DNA each generation. So let's understand, if you're trying to go back 300 years, you got jack crap for DNA for to be able to make any claim to be indigenous.
Okay, this is an example if you were to use your DNA, and it breaks it down at the starting of the chart, Native American ancestor at 100%, and it ends up at 1.56. And it says now your great-great-grandmother would get 50% of her DNA from her mother and 50% from her father. To make this easy, let's divide by 2 for every generation. So how much of your great-great-grandmother's DNA are you likely to have? Probably around 1.56, and that may not be enough to even detect Native American ethnicity.
And if you go back further than 300 years, now we're just talking about your great-great-great-grandparent, but if you take it back 300 years, it's going to be way lower than the 1.56% there. So, and it might even be none, because as 23andMe basically says on their website is that only a fraction. So if you look at the 100%, we know something's getting passed down to the great-great-great-grandparent, so to 50%. But once you take that grandparent and you look at what's going down to the 25%, that is just an example of what could happen. That full 25% may not even be there. It could be even lower than that. Okay, so DNA cannot link you to specific people, especially 300 years ago, and when you have just 1%, 2%, such a small percentage of DNA to even try to claim indigenous, you may not actually be indigenous. There's so many issues with DNA right now.
And the only thing that can prove that you're Métis is verified genealogy, where every parent, every generation, you can prove you are related to them with documents such as birth certificates, church records, all that stuff. DNA cannot link you to specific people. The science just can't do it.
And let me clarify, if you got such a small percentage of DNA, 1%, 2%, you are not indigenous, and you're damn sure not Métis. That is a fact. Alright, we're going to go ahead and give Gwen a call. Alright, so we have Gwen on the phone, and she's here with Timothy and Alexandria, and she has been doing genealogy research helping other people for 20 years. And she's been doing genealogy research herself for about 50 years. So Gwen, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And so the whole reason that we decided to do the show, Gwen, is because there's a lot of people out there that have 1% indigenous DNA, and they're trying to say that it can specifically link themselves to a specific indigenous tribe. And through all the research that we've done, we found that not to be true. What is your take on an individual with 1% DNA claiming to be indigenous?
The DNA doesn't lie, but I would find it very, very difficult to believe just based on 1% DNA that you can draw a conclusion as to a specific tribe or anything like that. The 1% would be enough that it actually shows up in genetic testing, but not enough to narrow it down by itself to any specific tribe or group, besides a really, really broad geographical area.
Yeah, and that's what we've been finding through the research. And I know when we spoke earlier, you were talking about different DNA labs use different algorithms. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, every lab that does their own testing, every company that you can test with has a different program that they use. They analyze it differently. Each one's unique, and they aren't trying to be the same. They're trying to be unique and set themselves apart from the others. And so whether you test at one of the big companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com are probably the biggest ones, but there are a lot of other testing facilities out there now. They don't agree. They will not agree, and they don't handle the data the same way. Your DNA won't change between those tests, but what they know to look for and how they analyze it is very different. So between one company and another, you may get really, really different results, especially when trying to define ethnicity. And I know for myself, we first got into DNA testing when like first rattle out of the box. I made everybody in my family group do DNA testing, which at the time was at 23andMe. And since that time, they have revised and revised and revised a lot of very specific things. One of the issues in assigning ethnic groups to someone's DNA is the database. So how many people do they actually have that they can confirm are, say, from Sardinia that have done DNA testing? They have to have some sort of a base group. So if from Sardinia they only have 200 people that have ever tested that can confirm they have that history, then if you only come up with 1% Sardinian, it's pretty questionable. But now the database has grown phenomenally. There's so many people doing DNA that you've got a really, really big database to draw on. So you can't just lean on one test or one source. You have to take a whole lot of other things into consideration.
Right, and that's why in Canada specifically, in the Métis communities, they do not accept or use DNA because it is such a huge issue and a huge problem.
Yes.
Specifically linking people to specific groups of people, especially if you only have 1% DNA. And so I would definitely think that 1% DNA would not qualify you as indigenous or qualify you to be a chief, which a lot of people in Canada are doing, believe it or not. And so that's definitely to us, it's just for scamming the government out of funding and getting indigenous funds. And so that's why we wanted to do this show, because there's some people that believe that if they have 1% DNA, that yeah, they're definitely indigenous, and they can go around talking bad about the white man and saying that, hey, I'm a chief. And we know that that's not to be true. You brought up 23andMe. Well, 23andMe on their website, they actually acknowledge that that there is no accurate way to link anybody with a low percentage DNA to any specific group.
That's true, and that's what I started to refer to in my own DNA testing, and I've got it now in 3 different places that I've got test results from. Now that Sardinian piece, and I am one of 6 siblings, and each one of my siblings has a different analysis of their DNA profile, including the ethnicities, and we are all full-blood siblings. There is no question about it. So it's not a very well understood science as far as determining origins. We can determine relationships better than we can origins. But now where we had, say, Sardinian, and even with, I don't know if you're familiar with haplotypes, there's a little piece of DNA that's passed from father to son ad infinitum. It goes all the way back to Adam. Same thing. There's maternal haplotypes that go from mother to daughter forever. So if you can line those up and you can find what your maternal haplotype is, you know that your mother's 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 mother on back forever have that same type. But they change minutely over time. It's little tiny bits of mutation over long periods of time. Even that has changed in the probably 10 or 15 years now since we first got testing in that was available to everyone, because our knowledge just wasn't there. We didn't have the knowledge. Something else that you and I talked about earlier is that the DNA testing alone is not enough. Everyone is a complex individual, and you have nurture, you have nature, you have the life that you lived, and you have biology, and both of those things are valid description of who you are and what you are. It takes both of them to make who we are, but they don't negate each other. And so we've got probably 10% of the population is estimated to have been raised to grow up with a father that they believed was their father, but in biological terms was not. But that doesn't negate your life. It doesn't negate who you grew to be. At the same time, growing up in a culture that may have been different than your parentage doesn't negate your DNA. I don't know if that makes sense, but we need to take the whole picture into account before we can really come to a conclusion. So in an area like this, you would want to have a person's DNA, and yes, that 1% might be significant, but it would have to be a triangulation of information. You have to have not only the DNA piece that shows your evidence, you also have to have 2 other supporting sides to that triangle. One of those is genealogical history, records, documents, or oral histories. You could put all of those things together, and then you have to have actual family evidence, and that can get kind of complex. But you can see why it would be very difficult to say if I'm 1% of anything without having knowledge of my ancestors having lived in the right areas, having records that show they relate, or finding the records of the biological ancestors that did relate to those places. It would be almost impossible to call that proof. Does that make any sense?
It does, because one of the individuals that we supported for 2 years that has very, very low percentage, 1% DNA, what happens is their genealogy, when you look at what they're claiming to be their genealogy, it goes back to 300 years ago, and this person has decided to label themselves a chief. And they have one indigenous ancestor from 300 years ago. However, they have not even proved that to be true. but that was submitted to us, and as we looked at it, there was no way that we could even prove that the claim of the one indigenous ancestor from 300 years ago was actually related to this person. They could not complete that genealogy bit. So what you're saying absolutely makes sense. We prefer a verified genealogy over DNA any day of the week.
Yes. Yeah. And each culture is a little different. Some cultures, they don't care at all about the biological feature. So we talked about the Sami, the indigenous far north Arctic Scandinavian people. And they really don't consider the biological genetic piece to be important. It's the cultural piece. They will adopt children that have no biological connection, and it's your family history that really matters. That's how they track. It's family history. And so for someone, say in America, like in our family, to do all of the grunt work and to follow the breadcrumb trail and find the Sami roots in their own history, the Sami would recognize that validity, but they wouldn't consider them a Sami person because they didn't share the culture. So like I said, one doesn't negate the other, but if you're going to make claims, you have to have the two of them coordinate with each other. They do have to prove each other in your case. So someone making that kind of claim would need to have very strong record trails. They would need to have histories. They'd need to have much more than just guesswork. And a lot of genealogy today is really easy to shape into whatever you want to be, because if you go onto the big sites like Ancestry, you can find a gazillion trees that have all the ancestors that you want, and you can cherry pick those and show those trees as evidence, but those trees aren't proven trees. The process that historical societies like the Daughters of the American Revolution, for example, uses, they have a really stringent system of proof that if you want to be, certified by them as one of their members, you have to actually meet standards. So, it's easy for people to pull things out of the air and claim them, but it doesn't mean that they actually meet any kind of standard.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree with everything you're saying there, and it's Alexandria.
It's Alexandria here, Gwen. In Canada, hi, with the Métis population in this individual that we keep referring to, 1% DNA. In Canada, any Métis government does not accept DNA as a singular identification point because it's just too vague. They rely on certified, verified genealogy that you have to have first your long form birth certificate that can tie you to your parents and then go back from that point.
Yes. Yeah.
And I like what you
would.
I like what you were saying, Gwen, about people on Ancestry. They can cherry pick from the trees and pretty much add people into their family tree there. And it's kind of like Genie.com. Good God, people using Genie.com, you could put anybody in there.
Yeah, it's just a hobby site, really. But there are a lot of people that don't understand that. And there are a lot of people that will exploit that. Because this is a great place to exploit, whatever. We all have this human nature that we have to deal with, and one of those things is to try to make ourselves look good and feel good and sometimes get rich or powerful when we don't deserve it. So, people are going to do that. They're going to go in there, even if it's pointless, and say, oh, look, I descend from Pocahontas.
Yeah.
And you might be able to find a genealogy that would say that, but when you get back into the actual histories, it's quite muddy. And there are some very well-defined genealogies that go back really far. Like Ireland and Scotland has some massive, massive long ones. Asia, people kept phenomenal ancestries that you really can verify. So I think that's your challenge. And what you said about the Métis government not accepting a singular point, that's where we have to be. You have to be able to completely prove and back up one proof with the other. They have to coordinate. They have to triangulate to make a full picture. And that's really what I do. Using DNA and genealogical research together, and then tying in all of the other associated facts that you can find that prove your point. And I generally work with trying to find biological parents or biological grandparents or someone in the past that is either hidden or for an adoptee because they don't know who their parents are, and so the only thing they really have is DNA. But we don't come to a conclusion and say these are your biological parents until we have all of the other evidence, the time, the place, the opportunity for those biological parents to be together, the documents that show it all fits together, along with a fully confirmed DNA analysis.
Yes, yes.
I hate that you're dealing with this, but it's inevitable.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in Canada, it's a big money-making thing if you can prove yourself to be Métis, and that's why a lot of people are fraudulently doing that. But Gwen, we do appreciate you coming on the show, and
Contact me anytime if I can be of help. I love solving mysteries.
That would be great.
That's what I do.
yeah, we'll definitely do that, Gwen. And I'll send you a link to the show if you're curious and want to listen to it later. I do
That'd be
appreciate
great.
you coming on, though.
Well, thank you for hunting me down, and it's an honor to be interviewed. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.